Hey guys, I'm Susanne, this is Jeremy. We just wanted to welcome you back to the Imperfect Show. And today we're going to be talking about something that a lot of us struggle with. Either now or maybe at some point in your life you've struggled with the issue of your identity. And where do you find your identity? Is it in your job, in your relationships, maybe in money? We talked a little bit before about the organization who we work with, Mighty Oaks Foundation, and we have programs for military service members, veterans, and their families. And this is an issue that we talk about so much during our time with them, and just the issue of our identity and where we put that in. And a lot of people really struggle with that. And this is something that maybe keeps us from moving forward in our life. And we've talked about this a little bit before, I guess, in a different context. But today it's really getting down to where do we find that and what does that look like for us?
Yeah, this idea of identity is something that all of us deal with. And if you're watching or listening and you would say, well, I don't have an issue with that, you're probably not being honest with yourself. You cause yourself some problems. And you see this in both men and women, and it tends to manifest itself a little bit differently depending on who you are. But you'll see, men, and they'll find their identity in their work. If you ask a guy, what do you do? What are you all about? They'll start telling you about their job and what they do in their work. They identify with their work. Yep. So they can find identity there. Sometimes, guys will find identity in an athletic pursuit or some kind of a hobby, something that they do. And you'll look at someone and say, that's who they are. It's what they identify with. The problem with that for guys is that when one of those things is taken away, they can't do the hobby or the sport anymore. They lose the job. They transition to something else. Because their identity was there, they don't know who they are anymore. And so they go into this cycle of trying to find themselves. We talk a lot and sometimes joke about the midlife crisis for guys, right? And I think not just men have midlife crisis, women do as well, but we see it more overtly demonstrated in men. What is that? It's a loss of identity somewhere along the way. They get to a point where they say, I'm not really sure who I am, so I'm going to pursue these other things. And there is great damage that can be done to a life and relationships on the other side of that. We'll get to that in a minute. So that's how it manifests in the life of men, but certainly in the lives of women, a lack of identity. Mm-hmm. We all have an identity, yep. But a lack of understanding your identity has real consequences. What does that look like for a woman who's really struggling with her identity? And where does that kind of take them in their relationships?
I kind of feel like for women, sometimes it's really difficult for them as life changes and as they progress in their relationships, and their relationships change over time. If you have children, your relationship with your children as they get older, if you tend to find your identity in the role of being mom, then as your kids get older, that goes away as they're kind of moving on with their lives, and then where you kind of feel a little bit lost. Right. And then as your relationship in your marriage, maybe you're getting older, things change in life, and so if you find your identity in that person of your spouse, that will change as well. Then friendships, as I think a lot of people tend to find their identity in, for women, having people around you that are helping you, but maybe they're not the right kind of friends, and then those kind of go away, and so then that kind of changes for you. And so really for women, I feel like relationships are huge because we're relational people. Right. And so as those change, if we're putting our identity in other people and kind of what they can do for us and how they can encourage us, then that could really be huge for ladies, and kind of be feeling a little bit lost in who they are and how they're moving forward. And I kind of feel like this has a little bit to do with what we talked about with as far as purpose, right? Because so much of our purpose is found in the roles that we have in life. Yeah. And similar to that with our identity, if we find our identity in just doing these specific things or that one specific thing, then that could kind of leave us feeling really lost.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this week. Because there was a women's program last week for Mighty Oaks, and we deal with we deal with all kinds of stuff. But we have students who, particularly on the women's side, are spouses of those who have served in the military or the first responder community, as well as those who are veterans, active duty service members, and first responders. And in each one of those categories, it seems that women will find their identity similar to others in what they do if they're in one of those categories. I am a veteran. I am serving in the military. I am a police officer. But interestingly, a woman who is married to someone doing those things will also find their identity in that. Can you talk about that for a minute? Because that's something that I know you counsel on a lot. You try to help people work through a lot. But finding your identity, not just in what you do, but in what someone that you're close to does.
Yeah. It's really interesting, I have found, when you meet women, especially in that setting that you mentioned, you meet them and you say, hey, my name is, so-and-so, and they say, my name is so-and-so, and you kind of start, and they're like, yeah, my husband does blah, blah, blah. And so it's kind of like, that's the first thing always that's said, not, I, do this, or I'm from here,
right.
The very first thing most women will mention is about their husband. Or if you're telling someone about yourself, tell me 3 things about yourself, or tell me something interesting about yourself. It's always tied to someone else, and most of the time it's their spouse. Especially, I would say, in the first responder military community, we identify so much of who we are with what our spouse does, and that kind of is something that because we're part of that community, and it's really important what your husband does in that community. And so we tend to identify ourselves with that because that makes us feel some worth, and that makes us feel like we have something to identify with, especially if we're not really sure of who we are. And especially in the military community, if you are the spouse of a veteran and maybe someone who's been injured in combat, or has some kind of trauma in their life that has caused them to be physically injured. And so your job now is to take care of them. And so a lot of women that I have met, that we come across in our women's program, they really tend to identify with that role of caregiver.
Right.
And so that's who they are, because that's what they spend all day doing. And so when you meet them, I am caregiver to my husband who was injured because of, and it's really, so that's what we really kind of see a lot, is that we identify ourselves with, what our husbands has done, or our husband's injuries that has caused us now to become their caregiver.
This is not only found in those communities, though, and perhaps someone's watching who would say, well, I don't identify with that because that's not my life.
Right.
We've been in ministry for a long time, and it's crazy to me how this plays out even in a ministry context. You look at someone who's in ministry, a pastor, and they're serving in ministry. Their spouse often identifies with them,
wife.
Right? And so there is there's a phrase, the pastor's wife. If you're not in church, maybe you haven't heard this, but the phrase "the pastor's wife" is not always an adjective to describe someone.
Right.
Sometimes it's a title.
Yes.
They are the pastor's wife. Well, the problem with that is the pastor's wife, begins to identify with who their husband is, or what he does. And this goes both ways, not to be sexist here. I'm not trying to be. I know it goes both ways. It just tends to go more, when you're talking about your spouse's job, it tends to be more a wife who would identify with that and latch onto that, and that's where their identity is found. And that's extremely problematic. What are some of the issues that come from, I would say, a misidentity, or identifying with these things that change? What are some of the consequences of that?
I think everything that you do becomes about that. And so you don't really have anything that would, for you.
Right.
Because everything that you identify with, the way that people see you, the way that you're able to minister, the way is because of that. It's tied to that title. It's tied to that maybe role that you have. And so, I mean, people can be kind of like put out on an island.
Right.
Really, you kind of put yourself like on this island, and there's really no one that you can be close to or allowed to come into your life, or maybe speak into your life, because now you're the pastor's wife, or you're, this person's wife. And so that causes you to have to fulfill that role in this certain way, and you completely lose yourself in all of that. And there's nothing that you have that is, maybe you could say, yours, that kind of identifies you as who you actually are. And so that is I would say that's one of the consequences of that for women to, as they're identifying really with that role.
And every conversation you have is about that somehow, or it comes back to that. Every struggle you have in life comes back to that.
Yeah.
I think this is true even of those who are dealing with trauma. We talk to a lot of folks who are dealing with trauma, and trauma is something that happens to you. It has often very lifelong consequences. you meet folks who are much older who can go back to something that happened when they were children. You know, it has lifelong consequences. It's not to devalue that at all, and things you have to work through and an impact on your life. The problem becomes when you identify with that trauma. Now I am that trauma. I am that thing that happened to me, that event that took place. I am that. You never really move past that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that we say, I say to the ladies is that, you know, you can be kind of moving forward in life and you have goals moving forward and you kind of know who you are, but then something comes along your way. It could be trauma. It could be something that happens to someone that's close to you. It could be something that completely changes. It could be a financial situation that changes with work.
Sure.
It could be, you know, a relationship that changes. It could be something that happens, like I said, close to someone that's close to you. And then you're completely just kind of knocked, I say, off the path of life.
Yeah.
And you don't really know how you're going to move forward from that. So what would you say would be some tools that people can implement into their life to kind of get them to kind of look at not just identifying with what those people around them are doing or identifying with that role? Even, you know, when we talked about in ministry, what are some tools that we can have in our lives that will help us to move forward?
Yeah, I think definitely, as we talked about with purpose, it's defining your purpose. There's a big purpose. God has created us to give glory to Him and to worship Him. That's your big purpose. And then finding your specific purpose in that. We talked about this in our last episode, but with identity, it's very similar. It's understanding that I am a human being. I'm an individual created in the image of God. And as such, I have an individual purpose, an individual identity. There's someone that I am. And although I do things, those things should not identify me. And we see this play out, not just with spouses, but with people who are wrapped up in their jobs and wrapped up in, their careers or whatever it is. When they lose those things, people ask me all the time, when you're dealing with veterans, when you're trying to help veterans who are going through all of these issues, what is the biggest issue that you deal with? And there are probably a number of things that we deal with and we try to identify and help work through. Some of it is trauma. Often it's childhood trauma. Sometimes it's trauma related to service. I would say that at least as much, if not more, the issue that we're dealing with is identity.
Yeah, that's true.
People who identified with a job that they did, a uniform that they wore, a rank that they had, something that they loved, and they've transitioned out of that. But that happens at every stage of life, whether you're in the military or not.
Yeah.
So I think the fundamental tool that you have to use in order to get beyond this is to understand that you're not the sum total of the stuff you do. Those things you do, it's stuff you do. But if you do something else, you're the same person. And if you go somewhere else, you're the same person, and you continue to carry that with you. You have an individual identity, and we can talk about where to find that identity. But backing up, it's easy to say that, but it's a lot harder to help someone who is the caregiver, who 20 hours a day, they're serving other people. Moms, they're serving little people all of the time. Their time is taken up with that. Those who are serving in the military, where 24 hours a day at times, 7 days a week at times, that's who they are. Not only are they called by that title or that rank, they're wearing the uniform that represents that. That is their identity. And then they go home and there's something else. Our law enforcement and fire professionals, it's the same thing. That's who they are. So I think getting to the point where you find yourself in all of that is really the struggle. What do you say to someone, again, as you have these conversations, what do you say to someone who is a caregiver who says, I'm glad you found your identity. I'm glad that's good for you, but me, my whole life is wrapped up in this thing. What do you say to that person?
I think it's interesting that you said you're not the sum total of the things that you do, because that's not. It's the things that you do. It's not really who you are. Right. And so encouraging someone that is literally like that, okay, well, these are the things I do, but it's also my role. It's my title. It's really. I have always encouraged people, or when I have those conversations, encourage people to find your identity in something that never changes. Find your identity in something that no matter what changes, no matter what the day might bring. I mean, you could be a caregiver for that person now, but when maybe they won't always be in that situation. Maybe this is not a lifelong thing for them. And someday they might not be in that wheelchair. They might not be continue to have those physical struggles that they have. And they might come out of that. And then what happens to you then? And so finding your identity in something through all of those things, that even when that is the daily thing that you do 24 hours a day, knowing in your mind and your heart that your identity is found in something, and you can find your identity in something that doesn't change.
Right.
So even if your situation never changes, and that is something that you continue to do for the rest of your life, but knowing that you are not the sum total of the things that you do, and that you yourself can find your identity in something, someone that never changes.
Yeah. Yeah, it has to be a real identity, just like it has to be a real purpose. It has to really reflect who you are. So we'll talk about that unchanging place where you find your identity, and that unchanging, we would say God and his identity for us. But let's ask this question: what impact does fear have on not only our current identity, what we would say that we are, but on our inability sometimes to move beyond that? Fear is very real. It's real for all of us. What keeps us from moving forward? Even when someone presents to us, your identity is not in that. You do that, but that's not who you are. There is more for you beyond that. You need to find yourself. Again, we talk about this in the context of our program, where I'll say to guys, look, you may have done all these things, but you're a man. you have a purpose as a man created by God to accomplish something. And we work very hard to convince folks of that, but often there's fear that prevents them from moving into that. I think ladies can be the same, where it's, I get that, I understand it, but it's really scary to think of doing something else. What role does fear have in preventing us from really putting our arms around a real identity?
For a lot of people, they've never really stopped to ask themselves those questions. Where do I find my identity? And what does that look like for me? And you've never really stopped long enough to ask yourself those questions, and to ask yourself, okay, well, if my identity is not in the things that I do or the role that I have, what is that?
Yeah.
So there's so much fear in actually stopping long enough to ask yourself those questions. And sometimes if you come, like you said, you come to the place where you're like, okay, well, I'm willing to accept that my identity is not in this.
I can believe it.
I can accept that, and I can, let's figure that out. But there's so much fear in stepping away from that, because like we said earlier, that there could be that feeling of loss and who I am now, and what am I. If you spent your entire life finding your identity in your relationships, in your job, in your financial situation maybe, then you might just feel a little bit lost. And there's so much fear in that, because now it's like, well, who am I now? And what do I do now? And there's so much fear in, okay, well, that's good, but now how do I, it's kind of, you're really put out of your comfort zone, really, in that. If you've become so comfortable in finding your identity with that, there's a lot of fear in being outside of your comfort zone, and in just knowing what to do with that.
Yeah, a bad identity is better than no identity.
Right. Yes.
we have to identify with something, and even if it's something we don't necessarily love, it's something that has been harmful or hurtful to us, or has prevented us from accomplishing other things.
And I think fear can be such a debilitating thing in our lives, and it can keep us in the place where we are, but it can also keep us from moving forward in maybe the new place that, okay, so now we're here now. It can just really keep us from moving forward in that too.
It's a crazy thing, because you can talk to folks. I say you can talk to people. You can talk to people that struggle with this. We all struggle with this.
I struggle with it
I can
every
be this
day.
person, right? So let me just, for myself, I can know the truth. I can understand I'm not that. I am this. That there's an identity, found in Christ that's bigger than me, and there are things out there. I become so overwhelmed with everything that's going on around me that you kind of lose sight or lose focus of some of those things. And you really struggle internally. And there's almost a physical, it's a crazy thing. When you hit that wall of fear, I need to get past where I am. I can see the road. I understand what's over there. But you hit the wall of fear. And really, what is fear? Fear is an apprehension or an anxiety about what might happen.
Right.
We have no idea, but it might happen.
Yes.
It might be worse than this. This is bad, but it might be worse. It could be better, but it will probably be worse, right? It's fear. And you hit that wall, and it's almost a physical response. It's emotional. I think it's spiritual in a lot of ways, but it's almost physical. I get it. I just can't do it. Understanding that truth has got to be a starting point for a lot of us where we understand, maybe I don't know what that identity looks like exactly, but I know it's going to be scary to take that next step, but I need to take that next step because. What is the because?
Yeah.
If I don't change, if I don't put my arms around my real identity, what happens?
I feel like for me personally, I can give a personal example that for my entire life, I have had this fear, sometimes physical fear, of getting up in front of people and talking. And even in a classroom setting, if I don't have to stand up in front of people, even saying something, like when I was in school, the teacher would call on me and I'd be like, oh, I don't know. It would just be, not that I didn't know the answer to the question, but just that physical fear that always has gripped me from saying anything in front of a group of people or standing up in front of people talking or whatever. And so I feel like as I've gotten older, there have been more opportunities that have come along to be able to do that and to be able to, we're in ministry for a long time, like Jeremy said, and standing in front of people and talking, or even just giving like a devotion in a group setting or something like that. I feel like there's more times that I've been placed in situations where I've had to do those things. And just that fear that if I had said, you know what, no, it's okay, I'm not gonna do that, or someone else can do that, or that, this is not the right time for me to be able to do that, that would really have, I think, kept me from moving forward in that way and allowing God to do a work in my life because of kind of stretching me in that.
Right.
And so that's the thing really is, what might not happen is that you might not be the person that you have been designed to be.
Yeah.
Maybe your purpose that we talked about last time will not be fulfilled the way that maybe you were created to be. And I like to say that everyone that is on this earth has been created with a specific design for sure, but then also for a purpose.
Yeah.
And we talked about that, kind of what that looks like, but I feel like as far as fear keeping you from becoming who really you were created to be, and that's different for every person, that's different for every situation, the dynamic of that looks different, for everyone, but really just knowing that we were designed in that way. And so allowing fear to keep you from moving forward in that will maybe keep you from becoming all that you were created to be.
Yeah, and it causes you to get stuck. It's amazing how we identify with our fear. And even our language betrays us in this, right?
It's true.
I'm afraid of heights. That's who I am.
Yes.
I'm afraid of public speaking. That's who I am. I'm afraid of relationships. That's just who I am. I'm afraid of, and we go through all these things and we kind of justify it or dismiss it with, well, that's just who I am. That's who I am.
Yeah.
That's my identity. Really? That's your identity? Your identity is that person. It's that, or that, not that person, but that fear is that thing. And we begin to identify with that. So we have a lack of clarity on our actual identity. We know we're afraid to take the next step, so it's easier to identify with that fear and say, well, this is just who I am, instead of moving beyond that and getting to the other thing. I think you're exactly right when you say it keeps us from really accomplishing everything we were put on this earth to do. How many people find an identity in a thing, when that thing changes, they lose themselves? Well, over here, they were super productive. They accomplished things. They helped people, whatever. It was great over here. But when that changed and they lost their identity in that, they got stuck. They stopped moving. And even though they were super helpful and super productive and amazing to be around over here, now no one wants to spend time with them. They have no relationships. They're not producing anything because that fear has prevented them from really moving into really their true identity, what they were really created to do.
A lot of life too is fear of change. So like the situation that you just described, sometimes maybe something has changed and we were really did a lot of things over here. We accomplished a lot of things over here. We stepped out of our comfort zone multiple times in this situation. But then maybe a situation changes, and maybe because your identity is not found in the right place, now that fear, that change has caused you maybe to be some fear like, well, I can't be that way here again. Like there's no way that I could do these same things over here again because my situation has changed. And so now I have to be a little bit, maybe do this in a different way. And so I think a lot of times fear even of change in situation, in relationship keeps us from, because we don't have the identity in the place, maybe where we should have it. And so fear keeps us from now maybe accomplishing things in this area over here too.
Yeah. Fear keeps us stuck, keeps us from moving forward, and keeps us from being productive, and makes us sometimes unpleasant human beings.
Yeah.
Because it's all about that all the time.
Yes.
Every conversation you have is about something that happened.
Yeah.
who you are.
Yeah.
So we've identified a problem. It has real ramifications to all of us, and we've all struggled with this. I remember, and we talk about this often, but when I left the Marine Corps, for a long time I struggled with, what does that mean now? And it caused me to be very unpleasant and not only unkind, but very confused and very frustrated all of the time, and that had consequences for our family and others. So it's very real, and it's something we all deal with, and probably something we all deal with again and again as life changes, as you mentioned. So where do we find our identity? You said it needs to be something that doesn't change, and I agree with that. What is that, and what does that look like when we talk about identity?
For me, the verse that I like to, there's a couple of verses in the Bible that I like to look to that really helps keep me grounded in this area of my identity. And one of them for me in particular is in Ephesians 2:10, where it talks about that we're God's masterpiece and we're created for good works because of that. And so that really speaks to me, and that we are created to be not just someone or something, but when you think about the word masterpiece and what that means, like when we talk about an artist or a musician that has done this great work and we call it their masterpiece, and knowing that God says that about each one of us, and that we are his masterpiece, that he has made us to show something very beautiful, and that he has we're an example of his greatest work in the way that he's created us, and that he looks at each person that way. And so that has really spoken to me in times where I felt maybe like a little bit lost. I think, you know what, God, who has never changed, who will never change, has said this about me, that I'm his masterpiece and that I'm created for good works, and that he has a plan for me and he has a plan for my life, and he has created me for this specific thing that he has for me. And that specific thing is to be for him who he's called me to be in whatever situation I find myself. But that one thing never changes, the fact that he made me to be his masterpiece, an example of his greatest work. And so that's really helped me a lot in times that I've just felt like, I don't know, this relationship's changed over here, this financial situation has changed over here, my job has now changed for the fifth time, and I'm doing something different than I ever thought I would ever do. But you know what? God made me to be something specific. He made me to be his masterpiece.
That's good.
And just an example of his greatest work. And he's done that for each one of us. Each one of us, that verse speaks to every person that he's made, that he's created.
Yeah, that's great. Identity really is the desire for value, I think.
Yeah.
And so we find value in the job that we do, the thing that we're involved in, even if it is unproductive or toxic in a lot of cases. Well, I find value in that. I find value in the struggle or value in the whatever. Understanding that the God who created everything values us because of who we are, that is our identity. And so it doesn't matter what else happens in our lives, whether it's good or bad or otherwise. When you ask the question, who am I? Who cares about me? Does any of this matter? There are a lot of people who will walk in and out on you, and things will come and go. That's life. Things will be good and sometimes bad. But the one thing, the thing that doesn't change, as you mentioned, the foundation, is that we have a God who not only created us but loves us. And the Bible even tells us that Jesus came for us when we didn't want him. He came because he loves us, and he demonstrated that love when he paid the price for our sin. And we understand that from Scripture, that we have a God who is eternal, who has never changed, who will never change, who loves us eternally. And when we find our identity in him, Romans chapter 8 and verse 1 is a verse I love on identity, because it says there's no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus. When you understand that your identity is in Christ, in your relationship with God, then there's no condemnation. What does that mean? It means a lot of things, kind of big picture. But for us, as individuals living our lives, it means that when people say we have no value, when people say we have no purpose, when people say we're not good at something, whatever, those condemnations, they're just words. They don't mean anything, because God loved us enough to give us value. And really, we should find our identity in him. That's a work. It's something that's not easy to do, and something we need to remind ourselves of again and again and again. But if you find your identity in anything other than your relationship with God, and again, this is a struggle, but if you find your identity in anything other than your relationship with God, you're going to hurt yourself on the other side, and probably a lot of people with you.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes it's a daily reminder, daily reminding yourself, and this is why it's so important to be, in the Bible every day, reading and kind of finding those truths in some of the verses that we talked about, and just helping you to be daily reminded of those things and those facts. And sometimes it's daily, maybe reading those same verses over again, or memorizing them and saying them to yourself. And sometimes it really is a daily thing.
It's a daily struggle sometimes, a daily fight. Fear will get in the way. But we need to push beyond that fear, understand that the God who created everything, who sustains life, loves us, not just us, but us as individuals, and cares for us, and we find value in Him. And that should change our whole perspective and outlook on life. Yep. Identity, such an important issue. Appreciate you guys watching with us, talking with us, and hopefully that was valuable to you. I trust that it was. If you have questions about any of this, go ahead and put that in the comments. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And we're keeping a list of some comments and some suggestions people have made, and we'd love to get to all of these things. We'll do this every week, so we'll get there. Please do that. If you have not yet subscribed, please do that. Share this content out. We produce this so that people can be helped.
Right.
That's the only reason.
The only reason.
And it's a good time, but we do it so people will be helped. Please share it out. And we'd love to hear back from you. So thank you.
Thank you.